First of all, thank you everyone for being here. We're very excited to have Sal Giambanco here with us today. As many of you know already, from 2000 to 2009, Sal served as the Vice President of Human Resources and Administration for PayPal and eBay Incorporated. At the time he was there, correct me if I'm wrong, Sal, but I believe your good friend Elon Musk hired you, and you were the 24th employee. When you left over 10 years later, the count was about 10,000 employees. Sal was instrumental in opening hundreds of offices in 24 countries. Then from 2008 to 2018, Sal led the human capital and operations functions at Omidyar Network, the philanthropic investment firm. In this role, he developed and scaled talent at Omidyar Network and its portfolio organizations. Sal now brings a wealth of executive experience in human resources management to the companies he advises, and is currently the chair of the board of directors at the Global Innovation Fund. Prior to joining PayPal, Sal worked for KPMG as the National Recruiting Manager for the Information, Communications, and High Tech and Entertainment Consulting practices, while also leading KPMG's collegiate and MBA recruiting programs. Previously, Sal directed human resources at Tech1 Incorporated and held positions at Ernst & Young and ESS Technology Incorporated. Sal began his career working in the public sector in a variety of roles, primarily in education and hospital ministries. Sal holds an MA in philosophy from Fordham University, a Master's of Divinity from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and an AB in economics and political science from Columbia University. Sal also is currently a lecturer for the University of San Francisco School of Management Silicon Valley Immersion Program. Sal is on the board of Teach for All and the Kolkata-based tech startup iMerit. So welcome, Sal. Thank you so much for being here today. You're on mute here. Sal, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Hi,
so just a quick few updates. It wasn't hundreds of offices. It was about 20 offices, 24 offices in about 18 countries. And then I've since rolled off the board of Teach for All, and I was a founding board member of the Global Innovation Fund, which was a multilateral public-private partnership. I represented the private sector. And our efforts in poverty alleviation globally, two of my founding board members won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019, and all of us founding board members have rolled off that as well. I still am on the board of iMerit, which is an artificial intelligence and software development company in India, and NASCOM just said we have more artificial intelligence and software developers than any other company in India, and we're a startup. So kind of very excited about the future of work and things like that, and on that piece, which is why I'm interested in 500 startups, because we've got to get artificial intelligence and software development right, for the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're thrilled to have you here today. We're looking forward to hearing from your experience and perspective. I did want to kick it off. You've had an incredible career doing a lot of different things. There's so many areas where we could start, but one I know everyone here as startup founders is interested in is that you're one of the relatively few people in the world who's had the experience of massively scaling a startup and building a lasting global brand. We know PayPal was revolutionary in being a tech company that was not driven by a social mission, but also made it clear they were fighting for the little guy and underrepresented or underbanked populations. So could you give us kind of a behind the curtains look at how that culture was shaped from the early days and how it trickled down through the company as you scaled?
So thank you, Courtney. It's a really good question, and it's important to kind of maybe back up to the individuals involved, and I worked with some extraordinary individuals, who continue to contribute to our wider society and culture today. You mentioned Elon Musk. I have to add to that group Peter Thiel, and I have to add to that group folks like Reid Hoffman and David Sachs. I think it's important when we look at the backgrounds, particularly of Peter, Reid, and myself. We're all, a lot of people don't know this, we're all philosophically trained. We all have either majors or degrees or minors in philosophy. And Elon was a physicist. He studied physics. And when you're looking at theoretical physics, there's massive overlap between philosophy and theoretical physics. And so there's, I think, often when I'm asked to speak in conferences, people think, that somehow there's a magic touch. In reality, it's about recruiting folks who have who really are authentic in their own sense of thinking. So I was the HR department of one at PayPal. Elon Musk hired me as the first person. And the benefit of that, I will say more than anything, is it gives me, it was the second time in my career that I was the HR department of one. When you're the HR department of one, even though I'd worked at large organizations like Ernst & Young and KPMG, you actually see the system of human capital. And it was understanding the system of human capital that I was later able to bring to the Omidyar network as we were pioneering non-financial forms of assistance to our portfolio organizations, both our for-profits and not-for-profits. And while I was at the Omidyar network, I had a hand in investing over $1 billion. Okay, so those sets of funds were about $1 billion. And so I think it's important to think through the system. And when I look at people like Elon, Peter, and Reid, I think everyone knows Reid Hoffman was the founder of LinkedIn. Peter Thiel has his hand in this organization, 500 Startups, and many others, including Facebook. These are folks who are deep thinkers, and that gets into, I think, the importance of understanding the philosophical and the theological implications of culture, which, when you're reading business texts, are often lost. So I went back to some of my old notes from some of my colleagues in philosophy, one of whom I've mentored for many years, who's on the faculty at Boston College, David Story, who's a brilliant thinker. And one of the important things about culture is, I'm going to talk about a philosophical definition of culture, and then I want to give a practical business definition of culture, which I think is very helpful for the audience. It's important to recognize from a philosophical perspective that a culture is the product and process of a cumulative conversation of a people about what is good, true, and beautiful, what is bad, false, and ugly, and about how to coordinate their actions in order to pursue the former and avoid the latter. Now, this has absolute implications for understanding, for example, if you really want to understand culture, human beings, remember, we are all human beings, and we value some things over others. And so that's what we're talking about when we're creating a culture. What are the things we want to value within our company over other things? Is there anything that's most important? And a corollary to this that's often forgotten is that human action is impossible and unintelligible without an implicit or explicit, and for most of us, it's mostly implicit and inherited, a hierarchy of values. And you can actually understand your values. Every organization that is on this call has a set of values, whether they're implicit or explicit, whether you've called them out or whether you implicitly follow them. Because it's how human beings actually engage in the world. We engage in the world through our behaviors, and our behaviors are a reflection of our culture and values. And so you can figure out what your values are quite simply in an organization by figuring out, in your own values, by figuring out how you spend your time, how your teams spend your time, and what are we paying attention to. Now, what I often advise is that we do this mindfully, that we pay attention to how are we spending our time. And as an executive coach to CEOs, it's the number one question I spend with them. In fact, I have CEOs, when I do executive coaching, bring me their calendars. I'm like, I want to know, what are you spending your time on during the day? Because that's what you're prioritizing, that's what your values are, and that's what your behaviors are, and they're showing up everywhere in the organization. And so again, understanding that. Now, the theological piece to this idea of culture is in the word culture itself, which comes from the Latin cultus. And cultus has actually, it's the past participle of the verb clare, which means to tend or to cultivate. But in the past participle, it also means to worship. And so one of the things I point out, that successful cultures create ritual. They create rituals around, for example, how we bring people on board. What are the rituals around our onboarding processes? What are the rituals around discipline? What are the rituals around holding people accountable? What are the rituals when we achieve great success? How do we celebrate? What are the rituals around the information and decision making? And do people understand them? And one of the things we have to remember that in a very noisy society that we exist in, our employees are begging for all these things. They're actually in the noise of Twitter, which is, and social media. And one of the things we have to remember is that culture also helps us adjust what I call the signal noise ratio. There's a lot of noise out there. There's never been more noise in our lives than ever, with 24-hour news cycles, social media, all these sorts of things, the stress of everything. And so how do we pay attention to the signals? And in CFOs, for example, when we're recruiting CFOs, or when we're looking at financial architecture, which I think everyone on this call knows, the number one reason why entrepreneurs fail is because they don't manage cash flow. That's the number one reason why an organization fails. So the CFO should not be a bean counter. The CFO needs to be someone who pays attention to that signal noise ratio within the financial architecture of your business. And so I just want to take a step back. I wanted to put that down as those are the philosophical and theological underpinnings of culture. And in the early days of PayPal, we had people like Elon, Peter, and Reed, and David Sachs. I'll throw in David Sachs. They're a very important entrepreneur in his own right. And remember, in those early days of PayPal, of the first 240 employees we had in California, over 40 of them went off and created their own companies. And from YouTube to Yelp, those are all folks who were part of, as many people know, the PayPal mafia. And of course, you have very famous investors like Vulture out of Sequoia Capital, et cetera. These folks are everywhere in the valleys, and you can't really sneeze without running into someone from the early days of PayPal or eBay. And that's where you have folks like Meg Whitman, Piero Midyar. Really important folks. Of course, Max Levchin, also a founder of the early days of PayPal. These are really towering folks. And the issue was that we understood what I just said in terms of the underpinnings of being mindful to our behaviors and being mindful to what are we paying attention to. So for example, in the early days of PayPal, PowerPoint was banned. You were not allowed to use PowerPoint. Because PowerPoint is a linear progression of thinking. And so we had to create memos. And in meetings, for example, we were limited in the number of meetings we had. You can have what we call analysis paralysis. We banned folks like, I'll be very controversial now because I come from this world. We banned professional consultants. Who speak in businessese, right? I always tell folks, we banned folks largely who had MBAs, right? I always say, what is strategy? It's a fancy word for what are you going to prioritize, right? You're going to spend $100,000 getting a degree in something you're going to prioritize, right? So it's like, what are you paying attention to? So it comes back to these basic philosophical principles, which I didn't enunciate, that Peter didn't enunciate, that Elon didn't enunciate. They actually go back to Aristotle. So the Greeks were talking about these things thousands of years ago. And that's kind of the basis of the culture, I would say, is paying attention to, the things that go into how we behave together in an organization and how we hold ourselves accountable. And so, in a business speak, now I'm going to give you the business definition of values, which is basically they break it into, people will talk about a value statement. And a value statement defines and codifies the deeply held beliefs and principles of the organization. And it establishes a standard that actions can be assessed against. And that's really important. It's a standard of behavior by which we judge. And the reason why that's important, and the reason why it is important, is that actually, if everyone understands your true north, quoting Bill George, who is on the faculty of the Harvard Business School. As an aside, I always thank Harvard professors because they spend their lives focusing on one little thing. They write a book about it, and I get the benefit of kind of peeling that off and making it more syncretic and basically more practical. The values, the reason why value is important is because it really speeds decision making. Because you spend less time trying to figure out and decipher what's going on inside an organization. It also allows you to grow your folks internally and have natural leaders available to promote who already know the values and behaviors. So that's one of the most important things. One of the most important statistics to remember is that when you're growing and you're hiring, when you're hiring from the outside, and the statistics bear this out, when you get to a certain size and you're hiring senior leaders, senior leaders who come from the outside, about 75% of them fail, truly fail. Now they may be hidden in the organization somewhere, but about 75% of talent that's not grown from internally is not very successful. And it's precisely because of this. The other benefit of really paying attention to culture and values is that this is what allows, prevents inconsistencies from developing across geographies or across teams. And so, because that's the easiest thing to happen when you're opening up offices, right? And as I said earlier, in order to understand human behavior, we all live by a set of values. And because we interpret our behaviors based on those values. And they're going to grow either organically or they're going to grow with your with a CEO's guidance. And again, from a business perspective, the classic definition of a company's culture is the beliefs, values, attitudes, traditions, practices, and assumptions shared by people at all levels. It shapes the way people think, behave, and evaluate. And it's represented in organizational artifacts such as language, decision-making, symbols, stories, and legends. Very, very important to develop stories and legends. I used to call it myth creation. I've advised a number of organizations on the importance of creating the myths, right? And remember, myth is a form of truth. So for example, it is true that in the early days of PayPal, we worked 7 days a week. We often slept in the office. On Saturdays, we would come into the office and all of us, would clean the office. We couldn't hire janitors and all that sort of stuff. I remember when one of the most important, I would say, inflection points at PayPal for me was when I saw someone watering the plants. We actually hired part of our custodian crew. And for the longest time, I was also in charge. I was vice president of HR and administration. So I was responsible for our offices. I was responsible for anything that happened. And I remember we had grown to a size. I was in Omaha where we had back office operations. And Max Levchin called me in the middle of the night saying, Sal, there's one of the urinals in the bathroom is over flooding. And I'm like, Max, you don't have to call me anymore for this. Number one, I'm in Omaha, so there's nothing I can do for you right now. But we actually have a maintenance person. We actually have someone who works for me, who's a custodian, who actually can come in. He lives nearby. He can come in and fix that. And again, those are two kind of inflection points about recognizing that you reach at a certain level. Probably the most important thing about a strong culture. You don't need an employee handbook. I hate employee handbooks. I hate rules. I like guidelines. And the reason why I like guidelines is because they test people's judgment. And the real issue for, I think, the younger generation today is an inability, because of that signal-noise relationship, is an inability to prioritize. It's an inability to present true problems, not just every problem. And it's an inability to solve the problems before they get to an executive's desk. And those are the skills that have to be developed at every level of the organization. If you're working 24/7 and not recharging your batteries, your intellectual batteries for reflection as a CEO, then you don't have the right team around you. And I'll stop there because that's kind of the backdrop of how we laid the foundations of a successful culture. Now, of course, that culture is long gone at PayPal, right? It became a very incredible international brand, but it's basically a behemoth of a financial services company. We never identified in those early days as a financial services company. We identified as a technology company that was engaged in financial services. I don't think PayPal would say that about itself today. And in fact, I remember the moment that it was time for me to leave, which was, I was in the elevator at our headquarters in Mountain View. In San Jose. This time we were in San Jose. And I was in the elevator and I got in, I was listening to these two employees talk to each other. And they were talking about, do you believe what the company is doing, that they're doing this and they're doing that? And the original PayPal was all about an attitude that we were all responsible for everything. That if there was an issue or a problem that we noticed, it wasn't someone else's responsibility. If we noticed it, it was our responsibility to provide a solution to help, regardless of the department, regardless. So there was a deep cooperation and team spirit, and not the fiefdoms that come along with the insecurities of executives who are basically at an organization, I think, for resting and vesting. And that's not the early days of PayPal.
Great, thanks for that, Sal. It brings up two questions that came in. One is around feedback loops. So how do we know when you're talking about these rituals, myths, all these elements that make up a great culture, how do you know you're getting it right? What are the feedback loops that you need to be looking at to get a good sense reflected back to you about the type of culture you're building? Separately, because these might have some overlap, when we talk about not having an employee handbook, these types of things that feel a little more rebellious, for lack of a better word, or less traditional in terms of business, how do you justify that with all the different opinions you have coming in as a founder who's taken on investor capital? So when an investor comes in and says, well, I really think, you should have this, or someone on the board says that, what would your thoughts or advice be for taking that less traditional path when you're getting a lot of pressure from different people?
All right, so that's let me deal with that last one first, the investor opinions, right? Because everyone has an opinion. In terms of investor opinions, the question for me about investor opinions is, it was related to best practices. And I always tell folks the best practice is the best practice for a particular organization in time and place. And when I speak, I often get asked about books, are there any business books that I recommend? And there are virtually no business books I recommend, because a best practice for one organization may not be a best practice in another organization, because each organization is a instantiation in a place and time. Different markets, different people. And as soon as you have different people running an organization, it's by definition going to be different. And so when investors are giving you their opinions, and I'm very careful about this. So when I was called in, right, as a human capital expert by our organizations, a CEO would often say to me, Sal, I have problems with recruiting, or I have problems, everyone has a problem with compensation, and everyone has a problem with hiring. Right? I always joke that I have never in my entire career met a hiring manager who has said they have too many people. And I don't care how large the organization that I ever worked in was. Every hiring manager says, Sal, I could do so much more if I had more people. And I'm like, all right, that's the wrong approach, right? But think about it. Have you ever met a hiring manager who said, Sal, Courtney, I think I have too many people. I'm going to give you some of my headcount. Right? No one ever does that. On investor opinions, check the source. Is this someone who has a track record of operational success themselves? Right? So are they quoting someone? Are they quoting, like the business press is crazy, right? Because it's the shiny object. It's a fad. It's basically a publication fad system. And nearly every business book should be an article. It's spread out to be a book so they can make more money on it, right? But there basically is one idea or two ideas in every business book that should be an 8-page article. Instead, it's a 200-page book. And so the investor, do they have a leg to stand on? Do they actually have a track record of operational success? Do they have experiential knowledge on the specific topic that they're recommending you to take behavior in? To change your behavior on, and that I think is really, really important, because if they don't have that operational success, I'm very, very careful never to give advice to a CEO or an organization without spending a lot of time with the organization and without basically having visited the organization, because to me it's like the Hippocratic Oath. I don't want to do any damage, right? When you don't have the full intimate knowledge of the individuals involved. And remember, investors don't have, in my opinion, there's a reason why they're called vulture capitalists. And those of you who know Endeavor, I don't know if those of you know Endeavor. Endeavor is the nonprofit that I was deeply involved with for many, many years. I'm still involved with them, particularly in the Middle East. And that builds the entrepreneurial ecosystems in the developing world. We now have Endeavor offices in places like Atlanta, Miami, Detroit, St. Louis. There's a bunch of them, Columbus, a bunch of them in the United States now. As an Endeavor, I'm known as an Endeavor emergency advisor, and usually that emergency is involved. Usually, in my experience, involves the investors trying to squeeze the entrepreneur from the value that they've created. And so, your cap tables, all those sorts of things are really, really important to pay attention to those. Be very careful about giving away I call it your sweat equity, because you're earning money for other folks. And that's why they're called vulture capitalists. And so do they really have your best interest at heart? The answer is usually no, unless there's a direct alignment there. And so I know I'm being a little critical, but you'll notice that I can be, I'll speak my mind, and I'm very, very open about a lot of these issues. So I think entrepreneurs and CEOs have to be very, very careful when you start accepting other folks' funds and you start getting into dilution. I think that's a real problem. So that's where does the investor, what's their intention? Where are they coming from? That's number one. And number two, do they actually have the expertise on that? So that's how I would deal with that. And always, you always deal with them respectfully. The other issue here is that the trust issue, which I was able to develop with human capital, where I could really find out what was going on with an organization. And this gets into the investor maybe making the wrong assessments, because you have to really get into an organization and understand that. So I had a number of times where I'd have, again, a CEO tell me, if I could hire X, Y, or Z, I could solve this problem. But that really wasn't the problem. The problem was maybe an organizational development issue. And I saw that time and time again, that the pain, kind of like anyone's gone to a chiropractor, you go in for a pain in your leg and the chiropractor is working on your shoulder. Right? It's kind of amazing, right? And so it's similar in human capital. The problem and the pain that's being expressed right now in the real time is a real problem, but the solution may not be the common one. It may not be the one that's popularly addressed. So, for example, in succession planning, you always hear about succession planning for the CEO. Well, that's important, right? Obviously, that's important. But what's really important is do you have a true organization and talent review? Do you have a strategy? Is your organization optimized to deliver on that strategy? And then do you have the right talent in the right jobs at the right time with the right skill sets and the right attitudes and the right behaviors in order to be successful at this time? Because as a company is dynamic, those rights that I just listed will change over time. So, for example, in the early days of PayPal, I used to advise employees that the biggest thing they have to worry about is not getting promoted, it's actually getting lapped. Because when you're growing at 50 to 100% every few months, the issue is the complexity of your job. I had mentioned I was the HR department of one. Right? So I can't do every aspect of HR. I can't be the benefits person. I can't be the comp person. I can't be the head of recruiting, and I can't deal with employee relations and then also coach my senior executives at the same time as we're growing. So you have to figure that out. You have to figure out what you're good at, and then you have to really build the team around me such that I could continue to be a global head of human capital for an organization like PayPal. So those are critical issues. Now, on the feedback loops, one of the most important things to remember is we are not trained to how to talk to each other. Now, there are very safe, and this is especially true in a culture that we live in today of microaggressions, where I can say something completely innocuous to Ms. Courtney, and to someone on this phone, I just said something that, makes them, want to commit hara-kiri, right? It's kind of like, it is blown out of disproportion. And this is a minefield. It's connected to the cancel cultures, and there's cancel culture on the left, and there's cancel culture on the right. And so we have to be very careful about all of these issues. It's the minefield of human capital, in my opinion, today, where you have the highest level of anxiety among young people in recorded history. Just a little factoid for y'all. Today in America, 40% of undergraduates take antidepressants. When I was in college, that number was 4%. So you're dealing with young people who have anxiety levels in the stratosphere. And then on top of that, there's an entitlement culture that exists among young folks as well. And then there's this microaggression culture and this whole, again, I'll just stop there on the microaggression issues. So there is trainings. In fact, when I work with organizations or teams, or when I used to actually, I'm more or less retired now, is to focus on these feedback loops is to train people on how to give feedback. And I use a method that was developed out of the Center for Creative Learning out of North Carolina some 30 years ago. It's the old VIX fortune, actually, if anyone's put VIX on their chest. And they actually developed something called SBI, Situation, Behavior, and Impact, which as an old Jesuit, I used to use in couples counseling, right? Which is, how do you get folks to communicate what they're truly feeling, and sometimes, very intimately. That again, this gets into that people who are legitimately feeling. For some folks, you and I might feel that these microaggressions are unreasonable, right? That used to be the standard of whether or not we deal with something was its reasonability. But there's an element of subjectivity in anyone who's dealing with that. So the issue is, how do we get folks to communicate something that is deeply important to them in a safe manner that can then process it? And that's that method. I'm not going to go into it now, but basically it's called SBI, Situation, Behavior, and Impact. And it is we basically, on the feedback loops, if you're being effective when it leads to better behaviors, right? That actually it's solving the issue and both parties are learning. That's actually how you know. Like we know instinctively when we leave a conversation. I used to coach young people on how to interview for jobs. And I'm like, you should always know when you leave an interview whether or not you got the job, right? Because there's certain questions you can ask that actually will determine whether or not you're in the running or not. And so every candidate should know that. But you could be, that's still training. It's training on how to talk. It's training, even more importantly, on how to listen. And that's what SBI does. What SBI does, there are methods of creating feedback in which you lower the temperature and you can actually have reasonable conversations because you're talking about behaviors without making judgments. And remember, we live in a celebrity culture. And we live in a culture that is constantly making judgments about someone. Subject, predicate, blank, right? You are, like, you can say whatever, you are great, you are intelligent, whatever it is. And if you think about those statements, there's no content to them. Why am I intelligent? Why am I great? And also, why am I ugly? Why am I terrible? It gets back to those values, right? Why is something ugly, or why is something beautiful in our company, organization, culture, family, or country, right? They all link together. And that's one of the most important things to remember is that all of our organizations, all the organizations on this phone, exist within the zeitgeist of the popular culture. And so we have to pay attention to popular culture, to pay attention to what's going on in that zeitgeist, and help the folks who are living that zeitgeist, again, who aren't philosophically or theologically trained, who aren't trained to actually understand what they're feeling. That's the problem with all the noise. That's the problem with Twitter. The problem with Twitter is that it actually puts sharing and information out there. Basically, it puts the cart of sharing before the horse of knowing what we ought to share. And I'll say that again, that's the problem in social media. It puts the cart of sharing before the horse of knowing what we should share. And so we never ask the question anymore. We used to in my generation, should I be sharing that? We used to have an expression growing up that I still use with some of my colleagues, right? TMI, too much information. Am I providing too much information? Should I be sharing this? And in our popular culture, the zeitgeist, where there's no sense of privacy, right? American culture today has lost that sense of privacy. Well, when you lose a sense of privacy, you're also losing a sense of propriety. And this whole issue of again, signal and noise. What's important, what's not important, and how do we know? That becomes really important in running a business because, again, do we have our employees paying attention to what they should be paying attention to? For those of you who have ever heard me speak at Endeavor, I've spoken at Endeavor events all over the world. I always tell entrepreneurs and CEOs in particular, there's one thing and one thing only that we really should all be caring about, which is revenue. Are we driving revenue? And does every employee understand that every behavior in the organization should be driving revenue? It's a long-winded way of talking about those feedback loops, but Ms. Courtney, I want to tell you that that question around feedback loops is the most important question with respect to human growth on the human capital side of an organization. And it's the most important question with respect to innovation. Because without that feedback, and I tell companies all the time, I've been asked to advise a number of companies, and I will tell you, once I see companies outsourcing core aspects of their customer service, they lose all information on improving their product or service or whatever they're engaged in, because the outsourcer does not care about the innovation of the product. They're just responding to metrics. You lose that data. So feedback loops are important at every level of the organization. I couldn't agree with that more. It affects marketing, it affects human capital, it affects everything. It affects every aspect of human behavior, because human behavior is one constant set of feedback loops, right? And again, getting back to values and behaviors, there's expected feedback loops, right? So Courtney, when I meet you for the first time, there's an expectation that, right, I'm going to say, good afternoon or good evening, and I might ask you, how you're doing, right? And there's kind of like these feedback loops. And if I'm paying attention, if I'm really paying attention, the most important question I can ask you in a human relationship is how you're doing. As many of you know on this call, I spend a bunch of my time in New Orleans, the South. And in the South, we ask a very important question when you meet anyone, which is, how's your family? And there's a T-shirt that says, how's your mom and them? How's your mama, right? If you think about classic American Southern culture, or even culture anywhere in the world, right? We're all concerned about our mothers. We're all concerned about our parents. And so, especially when we have aging parents, we really, they're on our minds. And if you're a parent, you know that your children are on your minds. And so that's the most important, that actually is the essence of any human being, is thinking about their families, right? Thinking about the ones they love, and they're always present. And so when I ask you how you are, really pay attention to that, because there's a wealth of information in understanding an employee. And I always tell folks, the number one reason why employees stay at an organization is because they feel that their managers care about them as human beings. And when you feel that someone cares about you as a human being, that person develops, as a Sicilian, what Sicilians prize more than anything, loyalty. That develops the primacy of loyalty, which means that those employees will then engage in the holy grail of human capital. And the holy grail of human capital is discretionary effort. Lots of studies on this. It's why I get invited to conferences. It's why, companies want me to, advise them, or CEOs want me to talk to them, is because discretionary effort is employees going above and beyond the call of duty. And I'll do a quick exercise with all of you right now, everyone on this call. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes just for 10 seconds, close your eyes. And then think about your top employee. Think about your top employee or team member. Now you can open your eyes, because that's easy. Everyone knows who in their organization they can count on when there's a crisis or a problem. That employee is the embodiment of discretionary effort. A few years ago, the Harvard Business School actually tried to quantify the value of employees who engage in discretionary effort. They're worth 8 to 10 regular employees. So if you have a team of 25 folks who exhibit discretionary effort, they're worth about 250 people. And that's extraordinary. That's data. That's extraordinary. So if you can get, and that's what an organization in talent review is trying to get, the highest competence of folks, but the folks who not only have a competence, but who basically care. What is discretionary effort? It's people who care about their jobs, people who care about the organization, people who don't want to disappoint you. Right? If you mentioned me to, if you were talking to Elon or Peter or Reed or Matt Bannock or Rajiv Dutta or Jeff Jordan, or, I worked for some amazing, Meg Whitman, I worked for some amazing CEOs. And the one thing that I never wanted to hear ever was, Sal, you've disappointed me. Right? That was worse than death to me. And that's what exists in folks who exhibit discretionary effort. they care and they want to do the best they can in that job, and they want to excel. And it's about their core being. And so that's why we create human capital. That's why, getting back to a question, Courtney, that you just mentioned, I never hired people with degrees in human capital, human resources. I did it once, it was a mistake. I always hire folks who are business folks. Again, I'm a philosopher and a theologian. I'm not a trained, quote unquote, human capital person, but I understand human psychology, and I understand human philosophy, human values, and I understand how we come together. Margaret Mead said many years ago that the only thing that changes the world is a small group of committed people. And if you go back to the early days of PayPal, it was that original 25, 50, I would say that first 100 to 200 folks in Silicon Valley that created and changed that organization. They're all gone now. I don't think there's anyone from those early days that are still there. And in fact, the definition of whether or not you're part of the PayPal mafia is were you a part of PayPal before eBay acquired us on October 3rd, 2002. And that's kind of like the cutoff date for whether or not you're part of the PayPal mafia.
Well, and there's a great related question here, Sal. So hiring for a seed stage company is difficult. Success hinges on effective recruiting. So do you have any tips on what a shorthand for identifying great talent might be, especially talent that's usually overlooked and underappreciated?
So that's a great question. And the biggest challenge in hiring is that we always want to hire folks who look like ourselves. And the reason why Silicon Valley is so successful, and when I give innovation talks in other places, particularly like Europe or places that are kind of stagnant economically and stagnant innovatively. I hope I didn't offend anyone in Europe, but or even most of the United States. I always remind folks of a couple of statistics. One is that 38% of Silicon Valley's engineering talent was born in a foreign country, right? So you have a place that I worked at 2 startups. I did 4 startups. My partner did 7. And in my startups, I've never worked at a startup that was founded by someone born in the United States. And that's a very, very important factoid. I worked at 2 startups where English was not the language of the office. I worked in one startup where Mandarin was the language that people used, was the lingua franca of the office. And I worked at another company where Hindi was the lingua franca. And this is in Silicon Valley. And so to what extent are folks willing to be innovative with their approach to talent, right? Are you willing to hire folks who I remember very, very vividly at PayPal. This is when I had a recruiting team, and my head of recruiting brought me this quote unquote challenge that he was dealing with, which was they were in the course of looking for engineering talent. They had found someone who was a brilliant engineer, but who was autistic. He was he was on the spectrum and would not be able socially to attend meetings and would have difficulty meeting folks. But they told me that he was, from a coding perspective, one of the most brilliant coders they had ever found. And I said, okay, so what we're going to do, as I said, we're going to, first of all, assign him a manager who will have the patience and the empathy to work with this young man. And we're going to put his cube right by the door. He's going to have a special badge. So instead of going through with the way everyone has to come through, like through the front desk and see the security guard, he's going to have a special badge that's going to allow him to come in through a back door. And so he opens that back door and sits at his cube, which is right by that door. So he doesn't have to see many people. And so the question is, to what extent are any organization going to create the environments in which the talent that we're talking about, the underserved talent, the undisclosed talent, is going to show up at the desk? And I'll give you a really startling factoid. and that is about the venture capital community in Africa. So, I've done work across the globe, and in Africa, 90% of venture capital funded organizations in Africa, in the sub-Saharan Africa, so Black Africa, have either a white African or a European CEO or CFO. The top brass. That's for 90%. And part of the challenges with that is because we like to hear people who sound like ourselves. The investor community, right? Getting back to the investor community, they expect to hear pitches in a certain way. They expect to hear their business ideas presented in a certain way. That was one of the reasons. It was one of the breakthroughs that we were engaged in at the Global Innovation Fund, which was allowing other voices to rise to the occasion. And the Global Innovation Fund was built on principles like the Omidyar Network, where we were capital neutral, but we were bottoms up. And over the course of the 7 years I was there, we impacted 100 million people. We brought 100 million people out of poverty. That's significant. And so these approaches work. And I always tell folks, you don't know what you don't know, right? And so what might, there's thought experiments that require time, require the CEOs, all of us, to engage in critical, quiet reflection, which is, what might a different world look like? Like, what might a different organization look like that would answer that question, Courtney, that would allow for different types of talent that is generally overlooked, right? Is generally. So, for example, the number one form of discrimination in Silicon Valley, and more widely speaking in the American economy, is actually not against minority groups. It's actually age. Age is the number one discriminating factor, if you were looking at discrimination in Silicon Valley. And so again, I'm a philosopher and a theologian. I like the data. I like all those researchers who spend their lives focusing on one question. I get the benefit of that, but don't hire them. Academics make terrible executives.
So there's some great questions coming into the chat. We also had some great questions submitted that I want to get to in these last 10 minutes. And I do invite anybody who has a question to put it into the chat. There's an interesting one here, Sal. I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but it's about whether HR is about protecting a company or protecting employees. And so I think it'd be interesting to get your perspective on how to think about that, and maybe how to communicate that with employees and with an HR team. Should I give you a couple here, or should we just?
Oh, well, let's do one at a time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
One at a time. Okay. Well.
Yeah. Let's do that one first. Yeah, I'll have you prioritize, and we'll just go through them. So I don't like that question. I don't like the narrative there. I always tell folks those two things are not inherently in conflict. What's good for the company should be good for the employees as well. And if there is a conflict there, then there's a bigger issue. It's probably a values issue, and it may even be a business issue. But I will tell you that the thing that I'm most proud of in my entire career is I've worked for dozens of CEOs, and I've advised dozens of CEOs. My hallmark, if you ask anyone who's ever worked for me, ever, is we will always do the right thing. And I always tell folks, doing the right thing is always good business. In fact, being ethical is always a good business practice. It may not appear that way. And this is where, in crisis, and this is where I'll get into a little more theology. In a crisis, this is where I say, talk to the attorneys, talk to the accountants, very important. But they're naysayers, and they're always going to advise under the guise of fear and anxiety, of darkness, of scarcity. And that question, the way you phrase that question, is a narrative of scarcity. And so in reality, that's a false narrative. If you make a decision when you are fearful, anxious, angry, what I call halt, and in fact, it's called halt, hurt, angry, lonely, or tired. Never make a decision. Never make a key business decision when you're feeling hurt or hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Never do that. Never make a key business decision when you are in that darkness. It's always going to be suboptimal. And think about your own lives. Think about the decisions you've made in your own lives. Whenever you've made a decision, sometimes we call it a hasty decision. No, in reality, it was a dark decision. Now think about decisions made from what I call the light of love and abundance. And I worked at a startup at PayPal, give you the economic background of PayPal, because PayPal, now with its hundreds of billions of dollars of capital, capitalization value. When I joined PayPal, here was the proposition. We were losing between $8 and $10 million a month. We lost $13 million in August of 2000. And we had less than 3 months of cash in the bank. Now, I was recruiting under those circumstances. So getting back to the person who recruits, every recruiting job is difficult. Now, some of you may or may not know I was in the Jesuits, which is why I had that career in public education, hospital ministry, and prison ministry. I worked at San Quentin as a prison chaplain, and I was a hospital chaplain to the terminally ill. And so I was also essentially, I was what we call a vocations person for the Jesuits. So think about that. Think about that level of recruiting. And I used to tell people all the time, I used to have to recruit young folks to take vows, permanent vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now think about that the next time you have a difficulty in recruiting. There's no comparison between the level of difficulty in trying to recruit people for the Jesuits and anything else I've seen in my entire career. And it's all a matter of strategy. It's all a matter of chunking it down. It's a matter of figuring out where the talent is. It's a matter of sweat to recruiting. So when people tell me, oh, it's so hard to do recruiting, that's nonsense. You can actually recruit anywhere and any circumstance. So think about what I just said. Oh, and by the way, if you're going to join PayPal in those early years at the end of 1999, I was informally working for PayPal at the end of 1999. Here's that proposition. 3 months, we're losing 5 to 10 at that at the end of 1999, we were losing between 5 and 10 million. It went up to 13 million, as I said. We have 3 months of capital in the bank. And also I'm going to ask you to take a 70% pay cut to join us. Okay, 70% cash pay cut. I had people taking 90, 95% cash pay cuts. And so and I always ask audiences, would you join that company? Because that's the reason why we had all those entrepreneurs who went off to start all those companies, part of the PayPal mafia, because they accepted that employee value proposition. Because, and if think about it, think about the people who would accept that employee value proposition, that you may be out of a job, you just interviewed for this job, and you may be out of a job in 3 months again, right? Are you going to join that company? And so these are the key questions in recruiting. These are the key questions in the culture you want to create. These are the key questions in the talent that you want to attract. So now that point about HR, it's a bad. I'm going to say this because as a professor, as a teacher, as a lifelong teacher, you're supposed to say there's never such a thing as a bad question. It's not a bad question, but it's a bad frame for the question because inherently there's no conflict there.
Awesome. I want to combine 2 questions. We've got like 3.5 minutes left. So sorry to rush you, Sal, because I know
it's all good. I can stay longer if you have time. I mean, we don't have to. I don't have a. But Zoom may cut us off. I know.
Yeah,
that.
I think we'll get cut off. So I'm probably going to interrupt you, and I apologize in advance.
It's all good.
There's a question around once you hire people, kind of what you were talking about, recruiting based on inspiration, and then later they're asking for more remuneration. How do you sort of deal with that situation? And the question that's somewhat related is when it's not a good fit, any tips on firing and maintaining culture at the same time?
Yeah, when it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit early. That's really important. As soon as it's not going to be a good fit, exit the door. I mean, that's just the number one. I've never met a hiring manager who said they waited too long to let someone go. So that one, easy. On the remuneration question, I worked at 2 companies. My first startup, where if you even talked about your compensation, you were fired. Okay, and in the early days of PayPal, I don't think he'd mind me saying this. If you brought up your salary with Peter Thiel when he was running PayPal, he would say that would be your last conversation at PayPal. because those things work themselves out, especially at startups. And this is where you have to be very careful about, are you hiring mercenaries or missionaries? And I tend to be quite harsh on that. I'm like, folks who are obsessing about their compensation, then they're not thinking about increasing revenues. And it's a very, frankly, it's they're not going to be exhibiting discretionary effort, and they're quite selfish.
There was another question submitted, different topic, but programs or tools that you recommend for deterring and preventing workplace harassment, specifically speakupalert.com. Is that one you might recommend?
So, I'm glad you said, I saw that question ahead of time, and I went up and looked at Speak Up Alert. I just want to say the backdrop here is that for the last 20 years, just about every corporate company that I've ever been involved in, because I'm also a philosopher, I've generally been the chief ethics officer of every company that I've been a part of, right? So I was always at, in these ethical questions whenever any issue of ethics or violation of behaviors came up, right? So this has been part of my career. I'm a trained ethicist. I was a medical ethicist, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as an ethicist, I always remind folks, we've always had 1-800-ethics numbers, right? Even in the early, before any of these apps developed, and before the Me Too movement, all those sorts of things, we had 1-800 numbers that anyone could call and who could anonymously report any issue around behavior. And so I'm a little concerned about, if my own sense is, I understand we live in a different culture and age today, but I just want to say there have been programs to address these issues at most healthy companies for a long, long time. And if you have a healthy culture with those healthy feedback loops, I personally, I don't think you need to call this out, right? And hopefully, the idea of, I'll go back. I had the good fortune of spending a couple of years working for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right? And the Dalai Lama actually has some very practical advice, business advice, which I believe in, which is what I'm saying and doing, is it kind, right? Otherwise, I shouldn't be saying or doing it. It's that simple. And kindness does not mean not addressing poor performance. In fact, that's the opposite of kindness, when I'm not addressing poor performance, because I'm doing a disservice to that employee, right? Because now we're creating a fraud when I have an employee who I'm not honest with when they're not performing. The kindest thing I can do is to give that honest feedback. But the question I have to ask myself, what is my intention in that how? I've advised CEOs, again, throughout my career, to say the following: the what is never the issue. The what, we can do anything. A company can do anything, right? And a CEO can do whatever they want, right? The issue is how they do it. How they do it. It's always about the how. Whenever a company gets into trouble, whenever a CEO gets into trouble, whenever a manager gets into trouble, it's always about the how. So the question is, are we simply hiring folks? And then here's the other issue. Do we also allow for a culture of mistakes and forgiveness? Part of the issue here is, I always tell folks, if I'm in human relationship with you, even as your manager, as your friend, as your partner, whoever I am, I'm always going to disappoint you at some point. I mean, I'm human, right? St. Augustine talks about, he talks about peccatum originale, original sin. He created that concept, by the way, for those of you in your theological lesson for today. And it's an allegory. And the idea of original sin is that the human species is faulty. And so let's embrace the fact that we're faulty, right? And so do we have in our culture, whether personally or in our firm, the ability to forgive when I make a mistake? I used to tell my team, and from Richard Nixon on, every president or whenever they get into trouble, it's not about what they did, it's about the cover-up, right? It's always about how they address their mistakes. I used to tell my team, I'll tell you all right now, I make mistakes every day, right? And so do I have a team around me who will help point out those mistakes and will help forgive me? And do I have the mindfulness to understand my mistakes and forgive myself and then engage in better behavior? That's called the feedback loop of innovation. right? That question is so important, Courtney, in terms of, do we create a culture of forgiveness? Do we create the elasticity in our relationship? That's what a personal feedback loop is, that there's enough elasticity to say that, Sal, when you were in that meeting with Courtney, or, Courtney, you and I had a pre-meeting, right? And there might've been something I said that upset you. And it's like, Sal, when we were in that pre-meeting, you said X, Y, or Z, and it impacted me this way. And if we don't have the elasticity to do that, where you can point that out, other than in an adversarial microaggression way, then you're not going to grow, I'm not going to grow, and together our relationship is not going to grow. So this element of feedback loops also has an element of truth telling, as an element of authenticity, but perhaps most importantly has this element of human frailty and human forgiveness.
I love that. Thank you, Sal. We are out of time. It was such an honor to spend this time with you. I'm getting notes in the chat about how helpful this was for those who attended, and we just appreciate you and appreciate your time and your advice here tonight. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, Courtney, and thank you for you and the team at 500 Startups. I've known y'all for many years, actually. For those of you on the call, I've known 500 Startups. They're part of the PayPal Mafia piece, and so I've known y'all for many years. And y'all do good group. You do great work, and I will tell you, the team that's assembled at 500 Startups today is probably the best team I've seen, in that organization. And I have dear personal friends who have worked there for many, who were part of the original group. And so they're also very talented. But I will say that the team at 500 Startups today is quite extraordinary. And so congratulations to everybody.
Well, I'm tipping my hat to Tracy here. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Sal. Bye.
Bye-bye.